This time we'll look at buying a used motorcycle. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Hello. Now for today's winter ride out, me and Dev are taking out the SV650. These have got a really good reputation in the second-hand market, but that's not to say that if you buy one of these machines, it's going to be trouble-free. Certainly if it's a few years old, that's definitely not going to be the case. And I think if you're going to buy a used bike, you should probably expect at least some problems. So let's talk about the sort of things that you just might encounter if you choose to buy a second-hand bike. Now, of course, if you are the well-heeled man about town, who's, just retired, has purchased himself a very expensive sport bike, you're probably not going to know what the hell we're talking about, because let's face it, if you buy something brand new, it's reasonable to expect that that machine is going to be reliable. That is not necessarily the case if you buy one second hand. And there are some things you should definitely be looking for. First of all, you need to be looking for obvious signs that the bike's been looked after. Cosmetically, does it look pretty good? If it looks tatty and it's dirty, that's not a great sign right from the get-go. And then look at the more obvious things. Chains and sprockets are often something that people who don't look after the bikes tend to miss. So if the chains and sprockets are really badly worn, the teeth are oddly shaped on the sprockets, particularly at the back, perhaps then it's best to walk away and look somewhere else, because there are plenty of bikes out there. Fork seals are another area that tends to go. These are perishable goods after all, and you would expect them to fail after a few miles. It's often the case that changing the fork oil is itself neglected, and this can lead to more leaks than you might expect. Simply changing the oil can fix the problem, but more often than not you will need to fix new fork seals. There are videos about this, I've done a couple myself, and it is a fairly simple job to do actually. So don't be put off by a bike that's got dodgy fork seals or dodgy sprockets. These are not things that are difficult to fix. It's a slightly worrying sign, however, that the bike may have been neglected. Another issue can be wheel bearings and headstock bearings. Again, look at these. It's really handy if you've got a bike that's got a centre stand. Many modern ones don't, God only knows why, but they don't fit them. Really, you should check that the wheels roll nice and smooth, there's no rumbling noises and there's no notchiness. Particularly in the headstock, when you turn the handlebars, they should be nice and smooth and they shouldn't be notchy. If they are notchy, then they're probably going to need new headstock bearings. Again, it's not necessarily a reason to panic. It is a good haggling point though. Ditto the wheel bearings, of course. Fortunately, the engines on most reasonably modern motorcycles are very robust. So really, you shouldn't expect problems in an engine on a modern bike, unless of course it's been really abused and people have skipped the oil changes and the servicing. You won't always be able to get a full service history. If you do get a good service history, that's no bad thing at all. You can't always rely on it, and again this can be a way that you can haggle the price down. So what are the fairly typical problems that you would expect to find on an older bike? Well, apart from all the consumables like the chains, the sprockets and the fork seals that we've mentioned previously, and of course the bearings, all of which are fairly easily replaceable, it's often the electrical system that tends to let the bike down. The alternators will only last so long, and usually what you find is you mysteriously come and find that the battery's flat. The battery of course in itself is another source of failure, because people who don't look after the bikes don't change the batteries very often, and they'll have just kept the bike on a charger or something to keep it going just long enough to sell it to you. However, if you put a voltmeter on the battery with the engine running, you should be getting a good 14 volts or so. If you're not getting that, it's a fair assumption that the alternator is worn out, and that's not unusual at all. They're not extremely expensive and they're not too difficult to fit, so it is a job that a household mechanic should be able to do themselves. Again, it's another point of haggling. The regulator rectifier is something that goes less often. Suzuki's always had a bit of a reputation for failure with the regulator rectifier, and in some ways this does persist today. We found with the SV that this was the case. Usually with regulator rectifier you're going to get one of three things, two being the most common. The most common ones are the thing simply doesn't charge, or the thing overcharges, boils the battery, or more commonly of course blows the bulbs, a very common thing for Suzukis, particularly in the 70s, where they had a reputation for blowing bulbs in the headlamp and in the tail light, simply because the regulators weren't very effective and they were overcharging. Less commonly, which is what we found on this bike, is occasionally you will find that the regulator rectifier will be kicking out not quite enough juice. A particular sign of this is when you rev the engine, the lights tend to dim. Obviously this is not what you'd expect. Normally you'd rev the engine, the revs would pick up and the lights would get brighter. If you find the lights are flickering and getting dimmer, it may well be the regulator rectifier that's at fault. And again, with Suzukis, this has often historically been a bit of a problem with them. You would think they'd fixed it by now, but occasionally this does crop up. Now in fairness, it's not just about Suzukis. When we had the Triumph TT600, a common problem with the TT600s seemed to have been fairly dodgy generators. They didn't fit the best quality alternators to begin with, and after 10 years or so in use, they usually burn out a few of the coils and they don't give very good voltage. So if you do buy a TT600 or similar, something like the Daytona, any of the 4-cylinder bikes, and some of the later bikes too, you may well find that your charging circuit isn't working very effectively. And you do find some historical problems with various companies. Most of these have been ironed out by now, but if you're buying some of the older bikes, it's still worth looking for. Classically, Honda's top ends, that is cam chains, cam chain tensioners and valve gear, were often a source of problems. You don't tend to see it anymore, but if you're buying a really older bike, it's worth looking out for. If you've got a Honda with a really noisy top end, and it's quite an old Honda, that may be the problem. With Suzuki's, it always seems to be the charging systems, and the other companies have their problems too. All bikes do wear out, so you should expect some problems when buying a second-hand bike. It's just whether those problems are going to be insurmountable or not. Simple wheel bearings and a change of alternator is not a big issue really, and shouldn't be overly expensive. And that's the balance you really got to get. If you're looking for a second-hand bike, particularly if you're younger, you've got to look for a bike that's going to be cheap to insure, cheap to run, and also you can probably fix yourself. So don't look for anything that's overcomplicated. So when choosing a bike, always choose a bike whose styling you like, bike you want to have and you want to be seen on. Don't always go to the very limits of your budget though. You're going to need a little bit of money back to fix any problems which can and almost certainly will crop up. If you buy with a sensible head, walk away from anything that just looks knackered, even if it's something you really want, then you should do well. And also you know that you can fix yourself, particularly if you're going for a second-hand bike, because you're not necessarily going to be able to afford the expensive garage fees. So if you go for a bike that's simple to repair yourself, that could be a really good choice if of course you have the necessary mechanical skills. Not everybody does, and of course it really depends what those problems might be. But if you choose wisely, then you should have a great experience with your first bike. I do hope you enjoyed that video and you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.